It is my greatest pleasure to introduce our opening keynote speaker, Aziza Kanji. Aziza is a legal academic and writer. She received her Juris Doctor from the University of Toronto's Faculty of Law and Masters of Law specializing in Islamic law from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London in the UK. Her work focuses on issues related to racism, law, and social justice. Aziza is a remarkable scholar and public intellectual whose writing has appeared in highly influential newspapers and magazines, including the Al Jazeera English, Harrods, Toronto Star, Truth Out, National Post, the Ottawa Citizen, Open Democracy, Roar Magazine, iPolitics, and the list is really, really long. I can stay until tomorrow, listing all the things, the wonderful things that she's been involved in addition to various anthologies and journals. Aziza is also the director of programming at Noor Cultural Center, which I highly recommend. Aziza's overall critical work on anti-Muslim racism has been truly inspirational for myself and for my students. And her academic and journalistic articles on the issue of anti-Muslim racism are required readings in a course I teach here at the University of Toronto called Race, Gender, and Islamophobia. My students, some of them are here today, feel empowered from the first few weeks of class when they read her article, a 2018 article called What is Islamophobia, which was published in the University of New Brunswick Law Journal, and proposes criteria to guide a development of a definition of Islamophobia in the Canadian context in particular. And for that, we are very, very grateful. Aziza's most recent publication, Islamophobia is Educator's Guide. It's a series, is also another tour de force that fills a gap in mainstream conversation about anti-Muslim racism. The series uses accessible and concise videos and is geared towards students, grade 6 plus, and adult audiences as well. Today, her talk is on Against Islamophobia, Beyond Invisibilization and Recognition, Mourning, and Apology. Please join me in welcoming Aziza Kanji to the podium.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Greetings of peace and justice. Thank you dearly to Professor Hashmi and the whole organizing committee for this conference for creating this space where we can deliberate together and discuss, where we can be vulnerable together, where we can speak from our hearts as well as from our minds. Thank you to all of you who are here today as well, joining in this conversation. The land acknowledgement with which we opened this conference is a profound reminder that we are having these conversations about anti-Muslim racism on land that is colonized Indigenous land, where Indigenous lives and sovereignty continue to be under ongoing state and private assault. A few days ago, we marked the second National Day of Truth and Reconciliation to grieve and remember those lives taken by Canada's residential school system in a context within which we know these violences, these genocidal violences, are not an issue of the past, in a context within which we know that only 11 out of the 94 calls to action by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission have been completed as marked, as documented by the Indigenous-led Yellowhead Institute, in a context within which Indigenous lands continue to be subject to state and corporate assault for the sake of pipelines and development projects, all across this land that currently calls itself Canada, from the land of the Secwepemc and the Wet'suwet'en to 1492 Landback Lane, destroying not only Indigenous worlds, but also the worlds of the many non-human nations that inhabit these lands, the animals, the waters, the trees, the plants. These are the very definitions of genocide and ecocide. The Islamophobia, which is the focus of our conference here today, has long been intertwined with the anti-Indigenous and anti-Black racisms lying at the very foundation and the very heart of the settler states in these lands now called the Americas. Intertwined since 1492, when Christopher Columbus embarked on his journey of pseudo-discovery of the so-called New World from Al-Andalus, lands that had been previously governed by Muslims, conquered, departing from the very ports from which the Jewish populations were being expelled from Al-Andalus, from their ancestral homes where they had lived for many years. Intertwined since the doctrine of discovery, the basis of the genocidal foundations of the Canadian state, which deemed that lands occupied by non-Christians were not truly occupied at all, intertwined since this doctrine of discovery drew on previous papal precedents authorizing the enslavement and dispossession of Jewish and Muslim communities during the Crusades. Intertwined since 16th century Spanish theologians and jurists debated on the humanity of indigenous peoples by deciding whether they were like Muslims and therefore to be massacred, the conservative position, or unlike Muslims and therefore to be converted into Christianity with violence always in reserve, the liberal position. Intertwined since practices such as book burning and demonization of sexual and familial relations were exported from the conquest of Muslim lands in Al-Andalus to the so-called New World of the Americas, based on the idea that the way to dismantle and demolish a people is to dismantle the bonds of learning and love that connect them. And these racisms have continued to be intertwined since precedents from the Americas' genocidal Indian wars have been explicitly invoked by the Bush government and others in justifying the practices of total violence in the war on terror, practices which have in turn been circled back to be applied against indigenous land and water defenders across the Americas. Intertwined since, as Canada is planning to purchase its first fleet of armed drones, justified in its letter of interest to potential suppliers for possible uses, including surveilling the Arctic, colonized indigenous Arctic land, and targeting for killing quote-unquote fighting-aged males in Afghanistan, whose only criteria for being targeted to death in this government document is the fact that one of them might be holding a cell phone and standing next to a shovel. These acts of violence, so casually described in a government procurement document, are violences that otherwise, inevitably, would be described as terrorism if performed by other actors, including those same Afghan men on the receiving end of these exercises of drone violence. So when thinking about Islamophobia and the project of building Muslim Indigenous solidarity, we understand that we have never been able to separate, if we are being truthful and just, that we should never have been able to separate the project of anti-Islamophobia from the project of Indigenous liberation and Black liberation on these lands, because these violences have always been inextricably connected to each other. To be honest, when I was thinking about what to say at this conference today, I had difficulty on deciding on it, not because there are no words for what to say, but because these words have been said so many times, over and over and over again. In the wake of the latest act of anti-Muslim violence, we write the same op-ed as we wrote following the last act of anti-Muslim violence. Year after year, at conference after conference, we give the same speech over and over again, perhaps adjusted to reflect the latest statistics on anti-Muslim violence, the latest act of mass killing in a mosque or on the streets, to reflect the latest statistics, whether anti-Muslim violence is at an all-time high or at a relative lull. We submit the same reports over and over again to government bodies claiming to deliberate on the problem of Islamophobia. Quite literally, we submitted the same report from a group of joint experts to the M103 hearings in the wake of the Quebec mosque killing, as we submitted to the National Action Summit on Islamophobia in the wake of the London mass killings. The only difference was that we had a few more anti-Muslim laws and acts of anti-Muslim violence to add to the report. Over and over again, we make the same arguments, we submit the same data, we make the same reports, and it doesn't cause any dent. at this latest National Action Summit on Islamophobia following the London killings, the killings of the Afzal family who were deliberately mowed down in the street by a white supremacist, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau told us, the assembled Muslim leaders and activists of the community, he told us, quote, "As I tell my children, you have to be patient because change doesn't happen in a day and I can't do it all by myself." Adding to the insult of being told we were being spoken to like children, the injury of justice perpetually deferred in a context within which we know it only took the government 3 months following 9/11 to pass sweeping new anti-terrorism legislation, but how many years did it take to even rectify the most basic and incontrovertible of injustices, such as the inclusion of children on the no-fly list who were placed there under suspicion uncontestedly on nothing other than the coincidence of sharing a name with someone who might somehow have some connection to violence, but who really knows, because the evidence and the list itself, in fact, is always kept secret to us. And if we are tired and frustrated as advocates, as if we are tired and frustrated of this dynamic, can you imagine the sheer exhaustion of those who have been living for years under the heaviest weight and sharpest edges of state violence? Imagine the exhaustion of security certificate detainee Mohammed Harkat, who in December will be marking the 20th anniversary of being under a security certificate, a regime under which he lives under constant suspicion and restraint without ever having been charged or tried with any crime, and in fact without even being permitted to see the evidence against him. Recently, he had new, stricter conditions placed on his freedom because of the accident of him having accidentally changed his computer password from starting with an uppercase to starting with a lowercase, or vice versa, so that CSIS agents inadvertently were unable to access his files. For this mistaken change, done completely innocently, he was subject to greater restrictions. And yet, CSIS agents, on the other hand, have been called out by courts for lying to judges so many times that a new private member's bill introduced by Salman Zayed is now introduced to formally legislate the duty of candor on CSIS agents. Legislation just to enshrine the duty that security agents entrusted with so much power should not be lying deliberately to the courts. This is the context of asymmetry that we are in, that an inadvertent mistake by security certificate detainee Mohammed Harkat leads to severe consequences, whereas CSIS agents and other security agents lie repeatedly to the courts without consequence, such that we now have a piece of legislation not even passed, who knows if it will pass, to enshrine the duty that they don't lie to the courts. Imagine the sheer exhaustion and frustration of someone like Abu Sufyan Abdurazik, who has had to fight for years for compensation for Canada's complicity, acknowledged complicity, documented by official review agencies, for his experience of being tortured in Sudan. And instead of paying compensation, the Canadian government continues to spend millions of dollars fighting his claims in court. Imagine the exhaustion of someone like Mohamedou Slahi, detained for years, mistakenly, wrongfully, in Guantanamo Bay, subject to a specialized torture program designed for him, signed off by higher authorities in the American government with Canadian complicity, detained on the strength of Canadian information. He too is being forced to fight year after year in the Canadian courts to receive any compensation for this acknowledged unfair ordeal to which he was subjected. Imagine the exhaustion of someone like Hassan Diab, who is now facing re-extradition to France for a quote-unquote terror attack which he could not have committed, for which he was exonerated, for which he was once already sent to France and held under solitary confinement for 3 years, when, according to the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, anything longer than 15 days in solitary confinement is a violation of the Torture Convention. exonerated, but now, yet again, facing re-extradition to France to face charges for the same crime which it has already been determined he could not have committed. The exhaustion of the family of Suleiman Fakiri, killed, beaten to death by guards, by prison guards in an Ontario jail. 6 years ago, the original autopsy report, despite acknowledging the beating, determined that he had died not because of this act of brutality by those in whose care he was entrusted, but rather because of his own faulty heart. And instead of recommending justice, recommended that the rest of his family also have their hearts be checked out for defects. Now we have a new autopsy report saying that yes, indeed, the cause of death was the beating. He had dozens of blunt force trauma injuries on his body and eyewitness accounts of the beating, and yet despite this, the government still refuses to press charges against the guards responsible. Finally, imagine the exhaustion of the Abanasawi family. Their son, Abdurrahman, diagnosed with serious mental illness, targeted for an entrapment operation when he was just 16 years old, a joint entrapment operation by the FBI and the RCMP. His parents thought that he was safe in his room. They were relieved, little knowing that he was being drawn into this plot that would lead to him now serving a sentence of 40 years in the notorious US Supermax prison of ADX Florence. His parents told me when they went to visit him a month or so ago that they weren't even permitted to see him face to face. They weren't permitted to hug him or comfort him. They were only allowed to interact with him through a glass wall. Imagine knowing that your child, who you had invested so many years of care into, now has his fate completely in the hands of this brutal American carceral system, while the Canadian state, complicit in this unjust criminalization, refuses to do anything. 3 years ago, in 2019, the Banasawi family submitted a complaint asking the newly revamped National Security and Intelligence Review Agency of Canada to look into this case. 3 years later, they still have not heard a word. They have not heard a word about the fate of their son. This is not to mention all of those lives about whom we almost never hear about at all on the other end of these Islamophobic operations of state violence. The Yemenis being massacred with weapons from Saudi Arabia, which is, as we know, the second largest destination of Canadian arms exports, a source of unjust and illegitimate profits for Canadian military corporations. The Palestinians, who continue to be subject to domination and occupation and dispossession and death, while Canada actively opposes an international criminal court investigation into the situation on the argument that Palestine should not have access to the criminal court because it is not a state. The very source of injustice against Palestinians, the denial of their sovereignty, being perversely cited as a reason to preclude them further, even further from justice. Those who will be on the receiving end of Canada's planned purchase of armed drones. As little as we hear about those targets of Islamophobic violence within Canada, we hear even less about all of these targets of mass death and maiming and torture outside of Canada. In academic and journalistic knowledge production, the idea of newness is fetishized and commodified. We exalt the newest hot take. We exalt the newest expose of the most recent incident of violence, the coining of a new concept or term to describe phenomenon that have been going on for years and decades, the revelation of new data telling us the exact same thing that the old data told us, that state violence continues to be pervasive and targeted, and in fact this new data does little but confirm that those same old problems continue to persist. The idea of newness is fetishized and commodified in academic and journalistic knowledge production, but as Muslim knowledge producers, as scholars, as academics, as activists, as journalists, it is highly dangerous for us to participate in this fantasy, in this idea of newness, because it perpetuates the dangerous fallacy that Islamophobia only persists because there is a lack of information and analysis about it, rather than what is actually the case, which is the problem is not a lack of information and analysis, but rather the active production of knowledges and what sociologist Lisa Snepnitsky in her book Disciplining Terror calls anti-knowledges, the active production of knowledges and anti-knowledges to justify and rationalize violence and domination of Muslims. The eminent philosopher Charles Mills, who meticulously tracked the centrality of racism to liberal discourses, coined the term white ignorance to describe how this ignorance is not simply a passive void or the passive obverse of knowledge, but rather the active production of racist knowledges that unblushingly present themselves as truth. And we see this very clearly in the everyday production of knowledges to justify, for example, counter-terrorism and counter-radicalization operations against Muslims, as well as the erasure of knowledges about the Islamophobia that we experience, rendering anti-Muslim racism illegible as a phenomenon. On the one-year anniversary of the mass killings in London of the Afzal family, for instance, the Ontario Human Rights Commission released a statement completely excluding the words anti-Muslim racism and Islamophobia, not a single mention, and simply stating that all Canadians and everyone in Ontario should have the opportunity to contribute to society, as if the issue is that Muslims aren't being allowed to contribute enough, not that we are being systemically surveilled, harassed, and an extremist killed on the streets and in our mosques. When pressed, they put out a statement on Twitter simply saying that Islamophobia is real or Islamophobia exists, stating what should have been completely obvious in the wake of the second mass killing of Muslims in Canada in a handful of years. And yet we have to fight so hard to have acknowledged as reality something that should simply be taken as a baseline truth. Who can forget also the reaction experienced by MP Ikra Khalid when she introduced a motion not even to do anything about Islamophobia in Canada, but simply to study it in the wake of the Quebec mosque massacre, eliciting not only death threats, but also widespread denialism about the reality of Islamophobia. In the wake of the discussion of the proposal of this motion, and in the wake of the Quebec mosque killings, a majority of Canadians still said that the reality or the existence of Islamophobia was being overblown in Canada. And so, even in the wake of not only the pervasive securitization, surveillance of Muslims, but in the wake of targeted mass murders of Muslims in the street and in our places of worship, we are still having to prove over and over again that Islamophobia exists. The gaslighting is so pervasive that every time, again and again, the existence of Islamophobia is treated as something that needs to be proven anew. As the prominent third world approaches to international law scholar Obiora Okafor has noted in the context of the war on terror, these claims of newness are themselves a very old, a centuries-old tactic of imperial violence, enabling the violence of imperialism to present itself perpetually as an aberration, a response or a reaction to the supposedly unprecedented violence and barbarism of the colonized, rather than being an intrinsic or inherent property of the colonizers themselves. And so We have to massacre Indigenous peoples en masse because they don't separate their women and children from their men in the villages in which we are attacking. We have no choice but to inflict mass collateral damage of Muslim women, children, and the elderly in the war on terror because it's the fault of the Muslim quote-unquote terrorists for leaving their women, children, and elderly in the path of our drones and our bombs. Colonial violence is pitched perpetually as an aberration, a response to the inherent barbarism of the dominated other rather than an inherent property of the colonizer itself. And these types of arguments, as Obiora Okafor very powerfully documents, are not simply the purview of those who are now considered to be conservatives or racists or the far right. Rather, they were espoused by the very fathers of international law who are now hailed as the founders of liberalism and humanism and human rights. A large part of the difficulty with addressing Islamophobia is its appeal to those all across the political spectrum, from right to left, from conservative to progressive. There's something in Islamophobia to appeal to everyone. And this, rather than being a source of contradiction, is in fact the source of its strength, its power, and its durability. Now, we see, for example, how feminist arguments, once used to predominantly to justify military exercises against Muslim countries in the name of saving Muslim women victims, is now being transmuted to supposedly recognize Muslim women's agency by proclaiming that no, Muslim women aren't just victims of violence, Muslim women can be terrorists too. And this perverse notion of equality for Muslim women means being securitized and surveilled as terrorists on a par with Muslim men. The great abolitionist scholar activist Angela Davis pointed out that in a carceral state, equality for women means building more prison cells so prisons can house as many women as they house men. Similarly, in our context of secure equality, equality for Muslim women means being treated as terrorists in the way that the men in our families, our brothers and fathers and sons, have long been treated as terrorists by the state. Anti-racism, too, is being used as a discourse to further bolster and expand and augment the national security state, whether it be by new proposed online harm legislation stating that it will address terrorist speech in the name of protecting racialized communities from online hate, but which we know are likely to be first and foremost used against those who have always been on the receiving end of online social media censorship, Palestinian people, Black people, Indigenous people. Whether it be terrorist entities listings that add a few white supremacist groups to these fundamentally unaccountable and unjusticiable mechanisms that continue to predominantly target Muslim groups, including Muslims countering colonial violence in Kashmir and Palestine. Whether it be the promulgation and the proposal of new measures in the wake of the killing of the Afzal family to further increase the power of legislatures to ban so-called hate rallies on their grounds, powers which, again, we know, especially in our current situation of the increasing criminalization of speech and solidarity on Palestine, powers which we know, given recent history, are likely to be used first and foremost against Palestinians and those in solidarity with them. Even our mourning and our grieving in the wake of massacres of Muslims have been used by the Canadian state in order to reinforce its systems of Islamophobic and anti-Muslim rule. Within this framework, the Canadian state depicts itself not as the source of structural Islamophobia, but rather as itself being the victim of Islamophobia, the injury being, in reality, to the Canadian state's sense of itself as a multicultural, virtuous nation. And so politicians come and cry at vigils in the wake of the latest mass killings of Muslims. And politicians, in fact, like former Green Party leader Elizabeth May, complain at Muslim town halls about how cold their hands were as they stood there mourning our dead community members with us in the January Quebec night. Politicians, Canadian politicians, come and cry at vigils and ceremonies for Muslims killed in mass attacks, even as the actual victims of those attacks are forced to fight for years to be recognized as victims eligible for victim compensation for the state, and as people like Ayman Darbali, who was paralyzed trying to stop the Quebec mosque shooter's bullets, did not receive a single note or a single visit from a Canadian politician while he was in rehabilitation, recovering from the bullets that he took. So who is this mourning really for? On the one-year anniversary of the London attacks, Justin Trudeau said explicitly, Islamophobia is not only an attack on Muslims, it is an attack on all of us as Canadians, obscuring the fact that for many Canadian industries and individuals, Islamophobia is not a source of injury or attack, but rather a source of profit and enrichment, whether it be the security agencies that in the wake of 9/11 received an extra $92 billion in funding in the first decade after 9/11 alone, or the military-industrial complex profiting handsomely off of the sale of arms to regimes that continue to slaughter Muslims like Saudi Arabia and Yemen, or those companies which are slated to provide Canada with its fleet of armed drones, justified, rationalized in the letter of interest to suppliers as a source of research and development and manufacturing jobs for Canadians. So no, Islamophobia is not an attack and an injury on all of us as Canadians. Rather, it continues to be undergirded by the systems of profitability off of Muslim disposability and death. Instead of constantly appealing to this state that, as the land acknowledgement reminds us, is predicated on ongoing genocidal and ecocidal violence, instead of constantly appealing to this state to recognize our humanity as Muslims, to prove to the state that we are not a threat, can we instead draw on Islam in conversation with other traditions relegated to the undersides of colonial modernity, Indigenous traditions, African traditions? Can we draw on these traditions to think about how we might transform this state away from violence and towards justice, beauty, freedom, and peace? Many of the Islamic teachings which we've heard about today, which are commonly relegated to simply the realm of private spirituality, in fact have profound social implications for how we order our relations with each other and with the world. The concept of tawheed, for example, which is the ultimate supremacy and unicity and uniqueness of God, which, as Islamic feminist and anti-colonial thinkers like Amina Wadud point out, is the fulcrum, the vertical fulcrum, which holds all our relations with each other as created beings in a relationship of horizontal equality with each other. Even the verse from the Quran which we recite when someone dies, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un, from God we come and to God we return. Even this, too, is a reminder that if we are all coming from the same place and we are all going to the same place, then all of these hierarchies created in between are constructed and can be deconstructed and rebuilt in a more just and equitable way. The more I talk to Indigenous teachers and scholars and practitioners living on the ground, the more I am struck by the deep resonances between our teachings that we inherit as Muslims and the teachings and wisdoms of Indigenous legal and ethical traditions. The idea that non-humans too, for instance, are nations whose rights and relationship with land and need for sustenance must also be respected. And so, instead of constantly appealing to be recognized as human by the Canadian state, my hope is that we continue to deepen our relations with those other nations and communities that have also continued to experience violence by the state, not to assimilate ourselves into it, but rather to transform it towards a deeper justice, as we say as Muslims, inshallah, God willing. Thank you very much, and I think, do we have time for questions? Yes, I look forward to questions. Yes.
How he was not being classified in a way that would allow him to get state compensation. So in my understanding, people who are victims of terrorism in Canada or Canadians who are victims of terrorism are entitled to compensation from the government. Why were the people who were affected by the shooting in Quebec, why did they not get that kind of compensation?
It was the widows of the men who were killed who had to fight for 2 years to be recognized as victims by the state, and it was because what the government was saying was that they weren't there at the scene of the crime, they didn't directly witness it, and therefore their psychological and mental injury wasn't serious enough and direct enough to qualify for victims' compensation. Now they've received compensation, but the very fact that at the same time you would have this collective mass mourning on the part of the Canadian state, while the people most directly affected and immiserated too by this event because they had lost the breadwinners in their families, were not treated with similar respect, with similar care for their grief, I think is extremely telling. And we also have to remember too that technically under the Canadian criminal law system, when someone is charged with an act of racist violence, criminally charged, the case is framed as the state versus the person who is charged. And so technically in the legal system, it's the state that's the injured party. But of course, when we're thinking about racial violence and in a context of pervasive structural white supremacy, it doesn't really make sense, and it's in fact obscurantist to depict the state as the victim of white supremacist violence, when in fact the state itself is a product of white supremacy, as the land acknowledgements remind us. And so what concerns me now about this discourse depicting Islamophobia and acts of Islamophobic violence as acts of quote-unquote terrorism and extremism is that they perpetuate this idea that white supremacism is something that's severable from the state, that it's a terrorism or extremism that is separate from the structural violence of the very same Canadian national security agencies, for example, which are now called upon to be the solution to Islamophobia, when we know that racism is pervasive within their ranks as well. And in fact, some of the details that we've heard revealed about what happens in these national security agencies, if they were described as being the acts of private actors, we would describe them as being extremism or terrorism. For example, in some of the complaints filed by former CSIS employees against CSIS for the harassment they experienced there, they described acts like a poster posted on the wall with the picture of 9/11 bearing the names 99 names of Allah, which is our respected words that we use to refer to the creator, or employees who wore hijab being forced to take polygraphs about their practices of worship or the people who they affiliate with in the community. And so I think we need to think critically too about the very way that acts of Islamophobic killing by private actors are described as terrorism in the first place, that can or can't be compensated by the state, when in fact these practices of killing and the most egregious and most widespread and most entrenched practices of killing are in fact the acts of the Canadian state itself. So Alexandre Bissonnette was convicted of murder. He was not charged with terrorism, and also in the criminal law, there's an option for terrorism to be treated as an aggravating factor at sentencing, which means even if the primary charge isn't terrorism, it can be used to increase the sentence. The Quebec judge in this case explicitly refused to exercise that option, saying that this was an act of individual psychological disturbance, that there didn't seem to be a wider collective ideological project, which is in stark contrast to the way that Muslim, quote-unquote, terrorism cases have been treated. And in this context, it's important for us to remember that none of the cases of Muslims charged with terrorism in Canada involved any fatalities, any causes of death. Two involved mild injuries. One of them was this case of a woman, Rahab Dagmosh, who was a Syrian migrant to Canada, diagnosed with schizophrenia, serious mental illness. She waved a golf club and a knife around in a Canadian Tire. Some of you may have heard of this case. She waved a knife and a golf club around in a Canadian Tire, caused one non-serious injury. She was charged with multiple terrorism offenses and given a multi-year sentence instead of care for the schizophrenia with which she was diagnosed. So we have a situation where Muslims have been responsible for 5%, 2% of deaths by mass political violence in Canada since 9/11, and yet constitute 98% of terrorism prosecutions in Canada, precisely because of these types of differences that we see in the way the Bissonnette case is talked about in these judicial decisions versus the way that the problem of Muslim violence or manufactured Muslim violence, because many of these cases involved preemptive plots formulated by informants or where informants played very great roles in developing them, that are then prosecuted and criminalized in terrorism. Is the solution then to charge anti-Muslim racists with terrorism? I think that that's extremely dangerous. It threatens to only provide a facade of legitimacy and anti-racism to a concept of terrorism that continues to be fundamentally racialized at its core. As someone from a Muslim community, knowing how Muslims collectively have not only been prosecuted and criminalized, but subject to collective surveillance, placed on things like no-fly lists, subject to measures of preemptive criminalization, like peace bonds and security certificates. These are powers that should not be expanded to reach further communities. Rather, they need to be deconstructed. And we know that terrorism can never be made race neutral. Even look at the terrorist entities list. They added a few white supremacist groups. At the same time, almost unremarked, they added several more Muslim groups, including a Kashmiri group. So this idea that we can de-racialize the idea of terrorism simply by adding a few white supremacists to the mix is a dangerous illusion that continues primarily to obscure the fact that it's the Canadian state and the U.S. state, it's states that really serve as the wellspring of racist violence, from which the private racist ideology of individual extremists like an Alexandre Bissonnette or Nathaniel Veltman is legitimized, and that's really what we have to focus on addressing. Yes.
Hi, I'm Aziza. I had a question for you. My question is, the tragedy of September 11, 2001 has generated significant consequences for Muslims around the world and reimagined the way that Muslims are perceived. Canadian Muslims were not excluded from the world's demonizations of Muslims, which can be seen through the academy and in academia as it's very Eurocentric and can actually be placed that perpetuates Islamophobia and frames Muslims as barbaric and inhuman. So how can we as academics help change the narrative and help change the discourse that constantly portrays Muslims as these barbaric, unhuman beings? And what can we do to put pressure on the academy to denounce these theorists and academics who continue to be supported by these institutions and empowered by these institutions to constantly say very Islamophobic things?
Thank you so much for that question. And because, again, when the problem of Islamophobia is framed as a problem of ignorance, the solution that's promulgated is simply that we need new and better knowledge about Muslims. But in fact, we have to recognize that Islamophobia is not a problem of ignorance. It's in fact one that has been supported and enabled and undergirded by the production of supposedly authoritative knowledges, including in places like the academy, including in courts, the highest bodies of authoritative knowledge production. I remember in law school reading cases where there would be references to this idea of Qadi justice, which is supposedly the antithesis of the rule of law, the idea that the Muslim legal system is just based on Muslim jurists. This is literally what they say in the cases: Muslim jurists sitting under a tree, dispensing justice according to their whim. The age-old myth of Oriental despotism, the idea that Muslims are inherently predisposed to despotic and authoritarian power structures, a justification for colonial projects against Muslim since time immemorial. The idea of Qadi justice, not really based on any serious engagement with Islamic legal systems, but rather plucked directly from the pages of 1001 Nights. And this continues to be reproduced, for example, in the cases that we read in law school on the idea of the rule of law. Edward Said's foundational book, Orientalism, documented, and again before 9/11, refuting this idea that Islamophobia is simply a production of 9/11, a response to Muslim violence, pre-9/11, documenting how authoritative knowledge production was intimately connected to projects of imperial and military domination of Muslim lands. And so we have to start from the understanding that the problem isn't simply a void of knowledge that academia then needs to step into to correct. Rather, it's to deconstruct these authoritative knowledges and anti-knowledges that have been produced about Muslims to justify projects like the war on terror. I believe we're running out of time, so I'll just say, I'm not in the academy, so I'd love to hear from you about what you're all doing here, but I think it's vital that we consider the funding sources behind knowledge production of Muslims. For example, government-funded research on counter-radicalization, which continues to depict extremism and radicalization as a problem predominantly of Muslims, of so-called foreign fighters going to places like Iraq and Syria, not fighters going to fight, for example, in Ukraine and Israel, and certainly not the extremism and racism and violence of the state itself. I didn't see any projects funded to consider the problem of state terrorism, even though state terrorism was the phenomenon for which the term terrorism was originally coined to describe the violence of the state. So my hope is that through this conference and similar exercises, we can begin to shift not only the specific knowledge that's produced about Muslims, but the frameworks and paradigms that are used to generate questions, problems, what's considered useful or valuable knowledge in the first place. So thank you, and Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you so much, Aziza Kanji, for that fantastic talk.